Chapter 1. Across the gulfs between the worlds, from end to end of a solar system poised taut and trembling on the verge of history, the rumors flew. Somebody's made it. The big jump. Somebody came back. Spacemen talking in the bars around 1,000 ports. People talking in the streets of countless cities. Somebody's done it. The big jump. Done it and come back. That last bunch, Ballantyne's outfit, they said a lot of things. Conflicting, fantastic, impossible, grim. But behind the words, there was only rumor, and behind the rumors, silence. A silence that was sphinx-like as the soundless wastes of night that roll forever around the island sun. Too much silence. That was what Arch Comyn listened to after he had heard the words. The rumors themselves seemed to have come most strongly along a line that ran from Pluto's orbit into Mars, and it was around Mars that the silence was deepest. Comyn went to Mars. The guard at the main gate said, "Sorry, you gotta have a pass." "Since when?" asked Comyn. "Since a couple of weeks." "Yeah? What's so different about the Cochrane Company all of a sudden now?" "It ain't only us, it's every spaceship line on Mars. Too many creeps wanting answers to silly questions. You got business here, you get a pass through the regular channels. Otherwise, blow." Comyn glanced briefly at the height and size of the locked main gate, and then at the steel and glassite box that housed the guard and the controls. "Okay," he said. "You don't need to get tough about it." He turned and walked away to where his rented car was waiting and got in. He drove slowly back along the strip of concrete road that led to the new, prosaic, and completely earthly city 4 miles away. Out here on the open desert, the cold Martian wind blew thin and dry and edged with dust, and there was no comfort in the far red line of the horizon, naked under a dark blue sky. Presently there was another road veering off from the one he was on, and he turned into it. It went round to the truck gate of the spaceport, which showed now as a low, sprawling monster on his left, with clusters of buildings and a couple of miles of sheds grouped around the docking area. The 9-globed insignia of the Cochranes showed even at this distance on the tall control tower. Halfway between the main road and the truck gate, and out of sight of both, Comyn slewed his car into the ditch. He climbed out, leaving the door open, and sat down in the dust. Nothing used this road but company equipment. All he had to do was wait. The wind blew, laggard, wandering, sad, like an old man searching in the wilderness for the cities of his youth, the bright cities that had been and now were not. The red dust formed tiny riffles around Comyn's feet. He sat, not stirring, waiting with a timeless patience, thinking. 2 days and nights I spent in the lousy bars here, with my ears spread to the breeze, and it was all for the birds, except for that one drunken kid. If he wasn't telling the truth. There was a sound on the road, a truck coming out from the city, bearing the Cochrane name. Comyn lay down quietly in the dust. The truck roared up, raced past, screeched to a stop, and then backed up. The driver got out. He was a young man, big and burly, burned dark by the Martian wind. He leaned over the body beside the road. Comyn came up off the ground and hit him. The trucker didn't want to stay down. He was mad, and Comyn didn't blame him for it. It took another hard blow to put him out. Comyn dragged him around behind the car and searched his pockets. He had a pass, all right. Comyn took his coverall and the cap with the broad peak and green visor that cut down desert glare. Then he fixed the trucker up inside the car so he'd keep safe until he got loose or somebody found him. On an impulse, Comyn dug out a couple of crumpled bills, hesitated, then shoved one of them into the trucker's pocket. "Buy yourself a drink," he said to the unhearing ears. "On me." Dressed in the company overall, wearing the company cap with the face-shielding visor, and driving the company truck, Comyn rolled up to the gate and showed his pass. The guard opened up and waved him in. One of the great sleek Cochrane ships was on the field, loading passengers for somewhere. Around the docks and the sheds and the machine shops, there was a clangorous turmoil where the work of servicing and refueling went on, with the huge mobile cargo crane stalking mightily through the confusion. Comyn glanced at it without interest, got his bearings, and turned the truck toward the administration area. Warehouses, office blocks, enough buildings for a small city. Comyn drove slowly, squinting at signs, not seeing the one he wanted. The palms of his hands sweated on the wheel, and he wiped them one after the other on his coverall. His belly was tied up in knots inside. That kid had better be right, he thought. I better be right. I'm in trouble all the way now, and it better be for something. He leaned out of the cab and hailed a passing clerk. "Which way to the hospital? I'm new around here." The clerk gave him directions, and he drove on, around 2 or 3 corners and down a narrow street. He found the hospital, a shiny white building designed for the care of Cochrane employees, not very big and tucked away in a quiet place. There was an alley behind it and a door that said delivery entrance. Comyn pulled the truck in, cut the motor, and got out. The door was only a step or two away, but before he could reach it, the door had opened and closed again, and there was a man standing in front of it. Comyn smiled. The knots in his middle went away. "Hello," he said cheerfully, and added in his mind, "I love you, little man with the hard look and the gun under your jacket. Seeing you means I'm right." "What you got there, buddy?" asked the man in the doorway. What Comyn had was a load of baggage destined for some ship, but he said, "Stuff for the hospital commissary. Perishable." He let the words drift him a little closer. "I've got the bills." He put his hand in his pocket, still smiling, a man without a care in the world. With the beginning of suspicion, the man in the doorway said, "How come you're so early? The usual time for delivery?" "What I've got," said Comyn softly, "can be delivered any time." "No, keep your hands right where they are. I've got something here in my pocket, and if it goes off, you'll know what it is, but you won't like it." The man stood taut against the door, frozen in mid-motion, his eyes focused on Comyn's right hand that was hidden in his pocket. He was thinking hard, thinking of all the small, nasty, illegal weapons that ingenious people on 9 different worlds had created and successfully used. He was not pleased with his thoughts. Comyn said, "Let's go inside." The man hesitated. His eyes met Comyn's, searched them, probed them. Then he made a small snarling sound and turned to open the door. "Quietly," said Comyn, "and if there's anyone around, you vouch for me." There was no one in this back corridor lined with storerooms. Comyn shoved the guard into the nearest one and kicked the door shut. "I'll take that gun," he said, and took it. A nice, neat shocker, the latest model. Comyn shifted it to his right hand and stepped back. "That's better," he said. "For a minute I thought you were going to call me out there." The man's face became vicious. "You mean you didn't have—" "I have now." Comyn's thumb flicked the stud up to lethal voltage. "Save your mad till later. Where's Ballantyne?" "Ballantyne?" "Who is it then? Strang? Kessel? Vickery?" He paused. "Paul Rogers?" His voice hardened. "Who have the Cochranes got in here?" "I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know? You're guarding somebody. You have to know who it is." Beads of sweat had begun to glisten on the man's face. He was watching Comyn, and he had forgotten to be angry. "Look, they brought somebody in here, sure. They're keeping him under guard, sure. It's supposed to be one of their own guys with something contagious. Maybe I believe that, maybe I don't, but all I know is that I sit on that back door 8 hours a day. The Cochranes don't tell me their business. They don't tell anybody." "Yeah," said Comyn. "You know where the room is. It's guarded, too." "That's where you come in." He spoke briefly, and the man listened, staring unhappily at his own weapon in Comyn's hard, sunburned fist. "I guess," he said, "I've got to do it." He did it. He took Comyn without a hitch through the main corridors and upstairs into a small wing of private rooms that were all vacant except for one at the end. In front of that one sat a large man, half asleep. That's what the kid in the bar had been mad about. They had thrown him out of one of these rooms and put him into a ward. He had been the only patient in the wing. And why had they thrown him out suddenly in the middle of the night? The large man came out of his doze and sprang up. "It's all right, Joe," said the man who walked so close to Comyn. "This guy's a friend of mine." His voice carried no hint of conviction. The large man started forward. "Are you crazy bringing a stranger? Hey, what goes on?" His reflexes were good, very good, but Comyn was already set and in range. The shocker made a gentle buzzing sound, and the large man hit the floor. The smaller one followed him, a short second behind. Both men were out, but nothing worse. Comyn had had the shocker back on low power long before he used it. When the young doctor looked out of the end room a moment later, disturbed by the faint sounds that had reached him, there was nothing to see but the empty hall with the empty rooms along it. He said, "Joe?" on a tentative note, but there was no answer. Frowning, he went down to the intersecting corridor to have a look. While his back was turned, Comyn slipped into the end room and shut the door. There was a lock on it, brand new and shiny, non-regulation equipment for a hospital room. He snapped it, and then he turned toward the bed, toward the man who lay there. His heart was hammering now, because after all, it might be somebody else. And the rumors were all true. Ballantyne had done it. He had made the big jump and come back from the outer darkness beyond the sun, the first of all men, come back from the stars. Comyn bent over the bed. His hands were gentle now, uncertain, touching the skeletal shoulder with a kind of awe. "Ballantyne," he whispered. "Ballantyne, wake up! Where is Paul?" He felt bones under his fingers, skin and bones, and a tracery of fragile veins. There was movement, a faint pulsation of it, a twitching and quivering of the flesh that never stopped, as though some dreadful memory still drove the ravaged body toward escape. A face. It was a face that was only a ghostly echo, pitiful, terrible, marked by something frightening, worse than death or the fear of dying. It was something, Comyn thought, that had never before oppressed the children of soul. A queer terror came over him as he looked at it. Suddenly he wanted to run, to get away out of the room, far away from whatever evil shadow it was that this man had brought back with him from another star. But he stayed. The doctor came and tried the door, battered on it, yelled, and finally ran away. And still Comyn bent over the bed and whispered, growing colder, growing sicker, flinching from the touch of damp skin twitching under his fingers. And still the terrible face rebuked him and would not speak. More men came and shouted outside the door. This time they brought an electric drill to cut away the lock. "Ballantyne, what happened to Paul? Paul! Do you hear? Where is he?" The drill began to bite on the plastic door. "Paul!" said Comyn patiently. "Where is Paul Rogers?" The harsh whining of the drill crept around the little room, filling the corners, filling the silence. Ballantyne moved his head. Comyn bent over so that his ear was almost touching the blue, transparent lips. A voice came out of them, no louder than the beating of a moth's wing. "Listened too long, too far. Where is Paul? Too far, too lonely. We weren't meant for this. Desolation, darkness, stars, Again, almost fiercely, "Where is Paul?" Paul. The drill hit metal. The whining changed to a thin-edged screech. The breathing skeleton that was Ballantyne went rigid. Its lips moved under Comyn's ear, laboring with a dreadful urgency. "Don't listen, Paul. I can't go back alone. I can't. Don't listen to them calling. Oh, God. Why did it have to be transuranic? Why did it?" The drill screeched thinner, higher, and the painful whisper rose. "The transurani! Paul, no! Paul! Paul! Paul!" Suddenly Ballantyne screamed. Comyn sprang back from the bed, blundering into the wall and staying there, pressed against it, bathed in an icy sweat. Ballantyne screamed, not saying anything, not opening his eyes, just screaming out of an abysmal agony of soul. Comyn stretched out his hand to the door and tore it open. The drill shaft snapped. Men poured into the room, and he told them, "For God's sake, make him stop!" And then, between two heartbeats, Ballantyne was dead. Chapter 2. Time had lost itself somewhere in the haze. He was not even sure where he was anymore. There was a taste in his mouth, a red and salty taste he remembered from getting hit in fights, only there didn't seem to be any fight going on, and when he tried to see, all he could get was a blurred vision of light and shadow in which things vaguely moved. The questions still came. They were part of the universe, part of existence. He couldn't remember a time when there hadn't been questions. He hated them. He was tired, and his jaws hurt, and it was hard to answer. But he had to, because when he didn't, somebody hit him again, somebody he couldn't quite manage to get at and kill, and he didn't like that. "Who paid you to do this, Comyn? Who sent you after Ballantyne?" "Nobody." "What's your job?" "Construction boss." The words came out thick and slow and painful. They had worn grooves in his tongue from being said so often. "Who are you working for?" Double question. Tricky. But the answer was the same. "Nobody." "Who did you work for?" "Interworld engineering. Bridges, dams, spaceports." "I quit." "Why?" "To find Ballantyne." "Who told you it was Ballantyne?" "Nobody. Rumor. Could have been any of them. Could have been Paul." "Who's Paul?" "Paul Rogers' friend." "He was the flight engineer on Ballantyne's ship, wasn't he?" "No. Astrophys." He couldn't handle that one. "Something to do with the stars." "How much did United Trade Lines pay you to get to Ballantyne?" "Nothing. On my own." "And you found out Paul Rogers is dead?" "No." "Ballantyne told you he was alive?" "No." This was the hard part. This was the worst of it. At first, reason had told him, keep your jaw shut. As long as they aren't sure, you'll have a chance. They won't kill you. Now it was only deaf-blind instinct. Comyn weaved his head from side to side, trying to get up, to get away, but he couldn't. He was tied. "What did Ballantyne tell you, Comyn?" "Nothing." The flat palm gently jarred his brain. "You were locked up with him for nearly 20 minutes. We heard his voice. What did he say, Comyn?" "He screamed, that's all." The cupped palm, bursting his eardrum, cracked his skull down the middle. "What did he tell you, Comyn?" "Nothing." The gentle approach. "Listen, Comyn, we're all tired. Let's quit fooling around. Just tell us what Ballantyne said, and we can all go home and sleep. You'd like that, Comyn. A nice, soft bed and nobody to bother you. Just tell us. Didn't talk. Just screamed. The other approach. Okay, Comyn, you're a big guy. You got scars on your knuckles. You think you're tough, and you are. Oh, yes, a very big, muscular, iron-headed character. But they don't come so tough they can't be softened. Fists this time, or whatever they were using. The slow dribble of blood down the side of his face, into his mouth, into his eyes. Pain in his belly. What did Ballantyne say? Nothing. A faint whisper trailing off. Voices, jumbled, distant. Let him rest. He's nearly out. Rest? Hell, give me the ammonia. The biting fumes, the gasp, the partial return of light, and it began again. Who told you we had Ballantyne? Who were you working for? What did Ballantyne say? There came a time when Comyn thought he heard the opening of a door, and then a new voice, angry, authoritative. He sensed a sudden change going on, things or people moving quickly in the reddish, half-blind obscurity. Somebody was doing something with his hands. Instinct told him when they were free. He rose and struck out, hit something that yelled, caught it, and held on with a single-hearted desire to tear it in pieces. Then it slipped away. Everything slipped away, and there was only darkness and a great peace. He woke up gradually as out of a long sleep. He was in a very comfortable bedroom, and a stranger was standing over him with a certain air of impatience. He was a youngish, well-fed, sandy-haired man who looked as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and considered Comyn an unwelcome addition to the burden, one he wanted to be done with as soon as possible. Comyn let him stand until he had dredged up what memories he possessed and got them in order. Then he sat up, very slowly and carefully, and the stranger spoke. No internal injuries and no broken bones, Mr. Comyn. We've done all we could for the bruises. You've been here 2 days. Comyn grunted. He felt his face, touching lightly. Our doctors did their best there, too. They assure me there won't be a scar. That's fine. Thanks very much, Comyn said sourly and looked up. Who are you? My name is Stanley, William Stanley. I'm business manager for the Cochrane Enterprises here on Mars. Look here, Mr. Comyn. Stanley bent over him, frowning. I want you to understand that this was done to you absolutely without the knowledge or sanction of the management. I was away on business, or it would never have happened. I'll bet, said Comyn. Since when have the Cochranes objected to a little blood? Stanley sighed. The old reputation is hard to live down, even though it was made 2 generations ago. We employ a lot of men, Mr. Comyn. Sometimes some of them make mistakes. This was one of them. The Cochranes apologize. He paused and then added, making sure that Comyn got every word quite clearly, We felt that the best apology lay in not pressing charges against you for some rather serious offenses. I guess that makes us even, Comyn said. Good. Your papers, passport, and wallet are on the table there beside you. In those boxes on the chair you'll find clothing to replace your own, which was beyond repair. Passage home to Earth has been arranged for you on the next Cochrane liner, and I think that's all. Not quite, said Comyn, and got stiffly out of bed. The room went round him twice and then steadied. He looked at Stanley from under sullen brows and laughed. Next step in the game, huh? You couldn't beat anything out of me, so now you'll try sweetness and light. Who are you trying to kid? Stanley's mouth tightened. I don't understand you. Comyn's gesture was sweepingly contemptuous. You're not going to let me run loose with what I know?" "Exactly what do you know, Mr. Comyn?" asked Stanley with a curious politeness. "Ballantyne. You had him here, hidden, in secret, when the whole system was waiting to welcome him back. You, the Cochrans, trying to grab away from him whatever he'd found. Dirty pool and dirty hands playing it. Where's his ship? Where are the men who went with him? Where have you got them hidden?" Anger was in Comyn's voice, a dark flush of anger in his cheeks. His hands moved in short, hungry circles. "Ballantyne made the big jump, he and the men with him. They did the biggest thing men have ever done. They reached out and touched the stars, and you tried to hide it, to cover up, to rob them even of the glory they had coming. So now you're going to turn me loose to tell the system what you've done? The hell you are!" Stanley looked at him for a long moment. A big, furious man, standing naked and incongruous in the handsome bedroom, the half-healed marks and bruises on him, still looking for something to hit. When he spoke, it was almost with pity. "I'm sorry to take the wind out of your sails so cruelly, but I broke the news 2 days ago, as soon as Ballantyne was dead. Far from trying to rob him, we were making every effort to save his life, without benefit of sensation-hungry mobs invading newsmen and people like you. Everybody seems to feel quite grateful toward us." Comyn sat down slowly on the bed. He said something, but the words were not audible. "As to the other men," Stanley shook his head. "Ballantyne was alone in the ship. The controls were almost completely automatic, and it was possible for one man to operate them. He was, as you saw him. He never knew he had made it back." "A hell of a thing," said Comyn quietly. "A real hell of a thing." "What about the ship itself and the log, Ballantyne's log? What did it say about Paul Rogers?" "That's all public knowledge. You can read it in any paper." "I want to know, what happened to Paul Rogers?" Stanley studied him curiously. "He must have meant a lot to you to make you go to such lengths." "He saved my neck once," said Comyn briefly. "We were friends." Stanley shrugged. "I can't help you. The log and the various scientific data gathered on the outward trip were all clear up to the time they approached the worlds of Barnard's star. After that, nothing. Nothing at all." Comyn's blood began to stir with a deep and almost unpleasant excitement. If that was true, the score or so of words he had heard from Ballantyne's lips were worth... what? Kingships, empires. A damn sight more, for sure, than the life of one Arch Comyn. Stanley answered, "No, there's no hint of what happened afterward. The log simply broke off." Comyn's eyes, very cold and cat-like, examined Stanley's face minutely. "I think you're lying." Stanley began to get an ugly look around the mouth. "Look here, Comyn. All things considered, I think you've been treated pretty decently. And if I were you, I'd go away quietly without trying everybody's patience too far." "Yes," said Comyn reflectively. "I guess so." He went over to the boxes on the chair and began to open them. "It would strain your patience pretty hard, wouldn't it, if I asked about the Ballantyne drive? The star drive he developed, the first and only one that worked. Did you happen to take a look at it?" "We did. And we did more." Suddenly Stanley was facing him across the chair, his words coming sharp and rapid, every line of him altered by a startling intensity. "You annoy me, Comyn. You make me sick, battering your way in where you haven't any business and making trouble for everybody. So I'll explain to you, speaking as a Cochrane, because I'm married into the family and consider myself part of it, and I'm tired of all the two-bit ciphers in the system taking cracks at it. We saved Ballantyne's ship from smashing head-on into Pluto. We'd had patrols out looking for it for weeks, of course, and we beat some others to it. We took the ship to our emergency field on Cochrane Beta in the asteroid belt, and we dismantled the Ballantyne drive. Then we flew it to the Cochrane estate on Luna, where nobody else can get at it. And I'll tell you why. Every one of these attempts to make the big jump has been backed by us or another corporation or a government that could put up the capital. No private individual could do it. Ballantyne developed that drive with Cochrane money. He built his ship with it, made his flight with it. It's bought and paid for. Now, are there any more questions you want to ask? No, said Comyn slowly. No, I think that's enough for one day. He began pulling the clothes out of the box. Stanley swung around and started for the door. His eyes still glittered. Just before he reached it, Comyn said, "You think I'm lying, too?" Stanley shrugged. "I expect you'd have talked if you'd had anything to say. And I doubt very much that you could have brought Ballantyne back to consciousness when all the doctors had failed." He went out, smacking the door shut hard behind him. And there it is, thought Comyn bleakly. A door slammed right in my face. The Cochranes are all fine, law-abiding people. Ballantyne's dead, the log-book has nothing in it, and where do I go from here? Home, probably. Home to Earth, with Ballantyne's ghostly voice whispering transuranic in his ears, with Ballantyne's awful screaming ringing in his soul. What had they found out there, those 5 who had reached the stars? What can a man see under this sun and another to put the look on his face that Ballantyne had had? He thought about those few disjointed words and what they might mean. Ballantyne had landed somewhere on the worlds of Barnard's star, and he had left Paul Rogers there, with Strang and Kessel and Vickery and something called the Transurani. Comyn shuddered. There was a tingling on his skin and a taste of something evil in his mouth. All of a sudden, he was sorry he had ever come to seek out Ballantyne and got himself entangled in the trailing edges of a shadow cast by an alien sun. If only Ballantyne hadn't screamed. And now the Cochranes were going to let him run a while. They didn't really believe that Ballantyne had remained quiet. They couldn't afford to risk believing it. There were too many others as hungry as they were for the stars, and Comyn, if he liked, could make himself rich by offering what he knew to the highest bidder. A corollary thought evolved itself, and Comyn turned it over in his mind. It seemed to make sense. The Cochranes, on the other hand, didn't know what Comyn knew, and they would let him live as long as possible on the chance that they could get it out of him. That was the reason for the beating and the reason for this so-called freedom he now had. It dawned on Comyn that he was in trouble, way in, over his head. He had expected trouble with the Cochranes. He had, in fact, come looking for it. But things had got fouled up, and here he was in the middle of something so big he couldn't even guess the end of it. It was a game for stars, and he, Arch Comyn, held just one little hole card. But whatever the Cochranes did to him, he was going to find out about Paul Rogers. Chapter 3. Earth was one long, howling shriek of excitement. Comyn had been back in New York for 4 days, and the frenzy had shown no signs of calming down. If anything, it was worse. Nobody slept. Nobody seemed to work. Nobody even went home anymore. They lived in the bars, in the streets, in the video houses. They swarmed around the public communications outlets and swirled in thick, purposeless torrents up and down the canyon streets. It was like New Year's Eve 1,000 times enlarged. The big jump had been made. Man had finally reached the stars, and every clerk and shopgirl, every housewife, businessman, and bum felt a personal hysteria of pride and achievement. They swayed in dense masses across Times Square, feeling big with a sense of history, sensing the opening drumbeats of an epoch in what they saw and heard from the huge news service screens. They talked. They drank and wept and laughed, and a surprising number of them, thinking of the vastness of galactic space and the many stars that there were in it, went into the churches and prayed. Suddenly it seemed as though some very doubtful doors had been opened upon them. Comyn had spent most of the 4 days since he landed prowling the streets. Like everybody else, he was too restless to stay in his room. But he had a different reason. He let the crowds drift him where they would, shouldering his way at intervals into one bar or another, drinking steadily but not too much, and thinking. He had a lot to think about. Life and death, the few last words of a man, the Cochranes, and a game of chess that was being played with stars for pawns. Stars, thought Comyn, and me. There I am, right up in front and all ready to get knocked over, unless I can figure the right way to jump. It took some figuring, and the problem was made tougher by the fact that he was no longer alone, even when he brushed his teeth. Out of doors, wherever he went, a shadow went with him. Indoors, in his furnished room, the privacy was only a hollow sham. Listening and scanning devices had been installed almost as soon as he rented a place. He knew it, but hadn't bothered to try to find them all and tear them out. The longer he kept the Cochranes guessing, the better. They're waiting, he thought, waiting for me to make my play. And what was his play going to be? The Cochranes, who had made 9 planets their backyard, were in this for wealth and power as wide as the stars. He had horned in for only one thing, to find out what had become of Paul Rogers. It hadn't been a very bright thing to do. But then Rogers hadn't been very bright either, to stick his own irreproachable neck out for a not-so-irreproachable mug named Comyn, who had got himself into very bad trouble. And Rogers had done that for no better reason than that they had lived on the same street and stolen apples together a long time ago. But bright or not, it was done, and he couldn't get out of it. The only thing left was to buck the Cochranes. He had studied the published reports of the finding of Ballantyne's ship and what was in it. Every account agreed that Ballantyne's logbooks broke off short with the approach to the system of Barnard's star. That meant either that the Cochranes were lying and had secreted one or more of the most vital books for their own uses, or that the Cochranes were not lying and knew no more than anyone else whether Ballantyne had landed or what he had found. If that was true, he, Comyn, was the only man alive who did know. He might, just possibly, have a weapon big enough with which to tackle the Cochranes. Or he might, just as possibly, have nothing but his own death warrant. In either case, it seemed a good idea to find out a little more about the meaning of a certain word, and that, at least, would be easy. Interworld Engineering had research labs in the same building that housed their home offices. Nobody could get suspicious if he went to the main office under cover of trying to get his job back. He went there, and the now familiar unobtrusive form in the nondescript clothes went with him as far as it could. Comyn left it outside the building, but while he was waiting for the lift, a combination of polished marble, light, and reflection from the doors revealed to him a thing that sent a quick, cold chill streaking up his back. He had not one shadow, but 2. He rode up to Interworld's floor, filled with an unpleasant sense of wonder. The Cochranes on his tail he could understand, but who else, and why? From the main office, he went up a flight of private stairs to the labs and asked for Dubman, a physicist he had gotten to know briefly during a sloppy Venusian spaceport project. Dubman was a brilliant little man who had turned waspish on the world because his liver wouldn't let him drink anymore. He stared when Comyn asked him, "Can you tell me something about transuranic elements?" "I'm not busy enough. I've got to teach high school physics to work bosses," Dubman said. "Look, there's a library with textbooks of physics in it. Goodbye." "I only want a fast breakdown," Comyn protested. "And it's important." "Don't tell me work gang slave drivers have to know nuclear physics now." Comyn decided to tell the truth, at least part of it. "It isn't that. There's somebody I've got to impress, and I've got to know enough about this to make a stall." Dubman jeered. "Are you going in for intellectual girls now? That's new. I remember hearing about your exploits, and I never—" Patiently, Comyn steered him back to the subject. Dubman said, "Transuranic elements are elements that, by our natural laws, shouldn't be and aren't." He paused, proud of his epigram. Comyn said, "Yeah, meaning?" "Meaning," said Dubman, irritated by the lack of appreciation, "that there are 92 chemical elements that make up everything in our solar system. They run from hydrogen number 1, the lightest, to uranium number 92, the heaviest and most complex." "I got that far in school," Comyn told him. "Did you? I wouldn't have guessed it, Comyn. Well, back in 1945, they added something. They built up artificial elements heavier than uranium, neptunium number 93 and plutonium number 94. Transuranic elements that didn't exist naturally on Earth or our other planets at all, but could be made to exist artificially. That was only the start. They kept building more and more complex transuranic elements, and finally Peterson proved—" He was off into technicalities until Comyn pulled him out of them rudely. "Listen, that's enough to go on. What I want to know most is, would transuranic elements have any financial importance, and how?" Dubman looked at him more closely. "So this isn't a wench after all? What kind of a game are you up to, Comyn?" "I told you I just want to run a bluff on someone." "Well, anyone with 2 bits worth of education will call your bluff. But in answer to your question, we get our atomic power from the heaviest elements, uranium, radium, thorium, and so on. Transuranic elements are heavier. Some of them can't be handled. Others are packed with power, but prohibitively expensive and obtainable only in small quantities. Does that answer you?" "Yeah," said Comyn. "That's answer enough." He walked out, brooding. Answer enough. Even with his limited knowledge of science, it was brilliantly obvious to him what the discovery of natural transuranic elements, in probably as plentiful supply as the high-number elements on Earth, would mean to the man or men who could control them. Here would be new sources of power greater than uranium, new properties as yet unknown to be explored and exploited from elements that had, up to now, only been the expensive toys of laboratory researchers. Perhaps even elements that hadn't been discovered or even guessed at yet. By the time Comyn stepped out of the lift, his brain was whirling with wild visions of atoms, electrons, and blazing bursts of power that paled the sun. They were vague, but immensely impressive. They frightened him. He picked up his customary shadow outside the building and, under cover of lighting a cigarette, looked around for the other one. This second watcher was more careful and expert than the first, who didn't seem to care much whether Comyn saw him or not. If it hadn't been for that accident of reflection, Comyn would probably never have noticed him. As it was, he had to let 3 matches blow out before he spotted the man again, a tall, slightly stooping figure in a gray suit. Comyn couldn't see his face, but something about the set and stance of him sent that cold flash up his spine again. Comyn didn't know nuclear physics, but he knew men. This one meant business. Was he the standby? The hatchet man sent along by the Cochranes in case things got beyond the capabilities of the mild-faced individual who seemed only to be doing a not-too-interesting job? Or had somebody else dealt himself a hand in the game? "Transuranic," whispered Ballantyne's ghostly voice in his ear. "Transuranic," the echo of a scream. There was a bar on the corner, and Comyn made for it. A couple of stiff ones stopped his insides from shaking. He switched to beer because he thought better on it, and went back to his brooding. He had found a place in the corner where nobody could get behind him. The bar was crowded, but even so, he could see his twin satellites. They were behaving like casual customers, apparently unaware of him and of each other. As he watched them through the haze of smoke, the din of voices, and the yeasty stirring of the crowd, he grew certain of one thing. The mild-faced man was unaware of the other one. If the Cochranes had sent him along for the dirty work, they hadn't told their other boy anything about it. The afternoon wore away. The big video screen at the end of the bar poured out a steady stream of speeches, special bulletins, rehashes, and fresh opinions about the big jump. The crowd picked them up, chewed them over, argued and chattered, and had another drink. Comyn stared gloomily at the bubbles rising in his glass. It became evening, and then night. The crowd changed constantly, but Comyn was still there, and so were the two men. The mild-faced gent in the rumpled jacket, and the other one who was not mild. Comyn had drunk a lot of beer by now, and done a lot of thinking. He was watching the men, and there was a curiously bright glint in his eye. The name of Cochrane sounded over and over from the screen, as often as the name of Ballantyne. It began to prick a nerve in Comyn, a nerve connected with whatever center it was inside him that made him hate. Mr. Jonas Cochrane, president of the Cochrane Corporation, today announced that his company would consider the Ballantyne Star Drive as something to be held in trust for the good of all peoples. Comyn laughed into his beer. He could just imagine the old bandit sitting up in that fantastic castle on the moon, thinking of the common good. The Cochrane Corporation has voted $100,000 to the survivors of each of the 5 heroes of the first star flight. Well, that was a nice gesture. Good publicity and deductible from income tax. Miss Sidna Cochrane has consented to say a few words about this historic achievement which her family helped to make possible. We switch you now to our on-the-spot reporter at the famous Rocket Room. The picture dissolved to the interior of a nightclub, furnished up in the style of such a ship as never sailed the seas of space. The camera focused in on a woman who was part of a group of expensively dressed young people being very gay at one of the tables. Comyn stared and forgot his beer. She wore something white and severely plain that showed her off in exactly the right places, and it was all worth showing. Her skin was very brown, with the magnificent kind of tan you can only get from a lunar solarium, and her hair, probably bleached, Comyn thought, but damned effective, was almost as light as her dress and was drawn straight to the back of her head, where it hung down in a thick hank as uncurled as combed flax. She had features that were bold and handsome and verging on the angular. Her mouth was wide, and her eyes were positively lambent. She was well geared, but held it like a man. The voice of the announcer came over, trying to make his introduction heard above the noise. Miss Sidna Cochrane closed her strong brown hands round her champagne glass and leaned her brown and splendid shoulders almost into the lens. She smiled. "Money," she said in a beautiful throaty voice, "is only money. Without the courage and the genius of men like Ballantyne, it accomplishes nothing. But I'm not going to talk about him. Millions of others are doing that. I'm going to talk about some other people that seem to have been more or less forgotten." Her eyes had an odd intensity, almost as though she were trying to see through the camera lens, through the screen, and find somebody. For some reason not associated with her low-cut gown, Comyn's pulses began to hammer strangely. Her voice rolled out again. "I'm going to talk about the 4 men who went with Ballantyne across the big jump and died doing it. Not our money nor Ballantyne himself could have done anything without these 4 men." She lifted her champagne glass in a gesture that could have been corny but wasn't. "I'm going to drink to those 4 men. To Strang, Kessel, Vickery, and—" Was the pause deliberate, or was she just trying to remember the name? Her eyes were brilliant with some obscure deviltry. "And Paul Rogers. And I know at least one man who'll be glad to drink with me, if he's listening." The mild-faced man started and glanced at Comyn in the bar mirror. The other one kept his eyes fastened on nothing, but his body moved on the stool with a slow, snake-like undulation, and he smiled. Comyn's heart jolted and then ran on again with a fast, steady beat. From that moment, he knew exactly what he was going to do. He didn't hurry. He didn't give any outward sign that he had heard Miss Sidney Cochrane or got her meaning. After a while, he rose and went unsteadily into the washroom. There was nobody in it. His unsteadiness disappeared. He flattened himself against the wall beside the door and waited. The one low window in the place was barred, and there was no way out of it. But if he waited long enough, the boys out there would get uneasy. Footsteps came from outside, going slow. Then there was the absence of sound that meant somebody was listening. Comyn held his breath. The door opened. It was the harmless-looking gent in the rumpled jacket. Without malice, Comyn stepped forward and planted one on his jaw so swiftly that the man hardly had time to look surprised. Then Comyn tucked him away in a place ideally adapted for concealment. He risked a fast run-through of his pockets before he left him. The man's identification said his name was Lawrence Hannay and his occupation, operative for a well-known private detective agency. He carried no weapon. Comyn went back and stood again beside the door. This time he had a little longer to wait. A stranger came in, and Comyn sweated blood until he left. Then there was silence again. There was no sound of footsteps. The tall man walked silently. Comyn could feel him listening outside the door. Then it opened softly and slowly, and the man came inside a step at a time, his left hand swinging free, his right hand in his pocket, his head hunched forward between his stooping shoulders. Comyn slugged him hard behind the ear. He twisted as though the movement of air in front of Comyn's fist had been enough to warn him. The blow didn't hit square. He fell, still twisting, and Comyn threw himself aside. Something made a tiny shrilling sound like an insect going past him and snicked against the tiled wall. Comyn sprang. The man was only half stunned. His body whipped and writhed under Comyn's knees, and his breath hissed. He had a narrow face and a bristle of rusty hair, and the teeth he sank into Comyn's wrist were brown and bad. He wanted hard to get his right hand up so he could shoot his little toy into Comyn without any danger of hitting himself. But Comyn was kneeling on it, crushing it down into the man's own belly, and both of them knew better than to let go. Comyn grunted, and his fist went up and down 2 or 3 times. The narrow skull cracked audibly on the tile floor. After the 3rd time, the man relaxed. Comyn sat him against the wall with his head bent over his knees in the attitude of a drunk who is passed out. With great care, he took the small, ugly weapon out of his pocket. It was one of the kind Comyn had threatened the guard with on Mars, and he thought how glad that guard would be to know that he had been shot at with it. He dropped it in the wastebasket under a drift of paper towels. Then he searched the man. There was nothing on him, not a card, not a name. He was a careful man. Comyn filled his cupped hands with cold water and threw it in the man's face. Then he slapped him. Eyes opened, narrow and colorless under rusty brows, and looked into Comyn's face. "You're no private op. Who are you?" 3 short, unhelpful words. "Come on, Buster. Who hired you to kill me?" Comyn lifted his hand again, and the man showed his brown and broken teeth. "Go ahead," he said. "See if you can make me." Comyn considered him. "It would be a lot of fun, but the lady won't wait all night, and this isn't exactly the place for that kind of a talk either." He showed his own teeth. "Anyway, you'll have a nice time explaining to your boss just why you didn't earn his money. I'll be back. I got a reason now." "Aw," said Comyn. "I've made you real mad, just because I wouldn't stand still. Isn't that too bad?" He hauled back his fist and let it go with deliberate and vicious intent. The man folded up quietly against the wall. Comyn went out, paid his check in the bar, and left. This time he was not followed by anybody. He found a cab and headed for the rocket room. He wondered about 2 things as he rode. The first was whether Miss Sidney Cochran had chosen a rather peculiar way of giving the signal to have him finished off. The second was whether her legs would measure up to the rest of her. He rather thought they would. Chapter 4. There were 9 pretty little worlds that moved slowly around the softly glowing orb of their sun. They moved quite silently in the ceiling, but you couldn't have heard them anyway, so loud was the buzz in the rocket room. And the buzz of voices had the one name all through it, the same as everywhere. Comyn got it all the way, from the men and women at the shimmering bar that had real pilot seats and a phony space window instead of a mirror, and from the crowded tables he passed. He thought of a screaming man and wondered bitterly, "Are you happy, Ballantyne? You made the big jump and you died, but you're a hero to all these people. Wasn't it worth it?" The waiter who happened into Comyn's path asked deferentially, "Did you want to see someone at Miss Cochran's table, sir?" But it wasn't a waiter, not a real one. When Comyn looked closer, he knew this man hadn't just happened. Comyn said wearily, "Yes, I do. Can you take that to the Crown Princess yourself, or does it have to go through the captain of the guard?" The waiter examined him without seeming to. "It would depend." "Yeah? Well, ask her if she still wants to drink to Paul Rogers." The waiter glanced at him sharply. "Your name is—" "Comyn." "You're expected, Mr. Comyn." He turned and led the way to the big table that was apparently in the best position in the place. It was the one Comyn had been making for when he was stopped. Miss Sidney Cochran watched them come. The man who was pretending to be a waiter spoke to her, received a nod, and went back to his post. She leaned back in her chair, showing the fine, strong lines of her throat and breast, and smiled up at Comyn. She had had a few more champagnes since he saw her on the videocast, but she was still holding them well. "So," she said, "you look like the type that could do it all right. Would it please you to know you've still got 'em spinning?" "Who?" "The Cochrans, round and round." She described circles with her forefinger. "All except me, of course. Sit down. Make yourself at home." Chair, glass, champagne, and genuine waiter had appeared like magic. Comyn sat. The dozen or so others at the table were chattering like magpies, demanding to be told who Comyn was and what the mystery was all about. Sidney ignored them. The tall, willowy boy who sat on her left peered across her shoulder and glowered. She ignored him, too. Pretty clever of me, I thought. That spur-of-the-minute speech, I mean. Real cute, Miss Cochran. So cute it nearly got me killed. What? 5 minutes after you made that crack about Paul Rogers, somebody took a shot at me. She frowned, and a shadow of some dark thought he couldn't read came into her eyes. Was that your idea? He asked her softly. My friend, she said. They shoved a camera in my face, and I spoke. Even in this modern age, there are thousands of places that don't have videos. You might have been in any one of them. She began to get her temper up. And furthermore, if you think... Whoa, he said, and grinned. Okay, I take it back. What about that drink? She continued to stare at him, her red mouth set and sulky, her brows drawn down. The clamor had now become deafening around the table. Comyn leaned back, rolling the stemmed glass slowly between his hands, not thinking about it, looking at the white dress and what it covered and what it didn't cover, letting her take her time. He was in no hurry. He could look at that all night. The anger went out of her eyes, leaving them lazy and full of sparks. I'm not sure I'm going to like you, she said, but I'm willing to find out. Come on. She uncoiled out of the chair, and Comyn rose with her. In her high heels she stood as tall as he did. You're lovely people, but you make too much noise. Bye. The willowy lad sprang up. Now see here, Sidna, he said angrily. I'm your escort, and I won't have... Johnny, you can't just go off with this character in the middle of the night. It isn't... Johnny, said Sidna, you're a nice boy, but Comyn can lick you. And if you don't stop minding my business, I'll have him do it. She touched Comyn's arm and swept on ahead of him, walking with a long, arrogant stride that even the high heels couldn't ruin. Comyn followed her, anxious to get away from the red-faced Johnny before he had to make good on Sidna's promise whether he wanted to or not. Her back, bare to the waist, was brown as a copper penny, and the hank of flaxen hair swung against it. Comyn watched the smooth play of muscles up and down that back as she walked. He thought that she could probably have licked the kid herself, without help. Quite a dame. He settled down beside her on the cushions of a limousine that arrived at the door almost as soon as they did. He turned a little sideways so he could see her. Well, he said, what now? She crossed her knees, burrowed her head back into the cushions, and yawned like a cat. I haven't decided yet. The chauffeur, apparently accustomed to such vagaries, began to drive slowly along, going nowhere in particular. Sidna lay back in her corner and watched Comyn from under half-closed lids. The flicker of passing lights gleamed on her white dress, touched her hair, her mouth, the angle of a cheekbone. I'm sleepy, she said. Too sleepy to tell me what you wanted with me? Curiosity. Wanted to see the man the Cochrans couldn't keep out. She smiled with sudden malice. I wanted to see the man that got Willie in Dutch. Who's Willie? My little cousin's beloved husband, Stanley. She leaned forward. Do you like Stanley? I can't say I'm bursting over with affection for him. He's a louse, said Sidna, and relaxed again into the upholstery, brooding. Then she clicked open the communicator. I've decided, she said. Take us to the spaceport. Yes, Miss Cochran, said the chauffeur, stifling a yawn, and the communicator snapped shut again. Us, said Comyn. I told you maybe we'd go to the moon. Don't I have a choice in the matter? Don't kid me, Comyn. Right in the middle of the Cochran stronghold, you're crazy to get there. He leaned over her, putting his hand on the smooth ridge of muscles where her neck curved into her shoulder. It quivered slightly, and he tightened his fingers. "I don't like having my mind made up for me," he said. "Not too fast." "Neither do I," said Sidna, and put her hands up alongside his head. Her nails bit suddenly into the flesh behind his ears, pulling his head down. She was laughing. After a while, he straightened up and said, "You play rough." "I grew up with 3 brothers. I had to play rough or not play." They looked at each other in the half-dark. They were hot-eyed, bristling, between anger and excitement. Then she said slowly, almost viciously, "You'll come because there's something up there you'll want to see." "What?" She didn't answer. Quite suddenly she had begun to shiver, her hands clasped tight together in her lap. "Buy me a drink, Comyn." "Haven't you had enough?" "There isn't enough in New York." "What have you people got now up there on the moon?" "Progress, expansion, glory, the stars." She swore, still quivering. "Why did Ballantyne have to make his damn trip, Comyn? Weren't 9 worlds enough room to make trouble in? Trouble, that's what we've got up there. That's why I came to Earth." She lifted those wide brown shoulders and let them fall. "I'm a Cochrane, and I'm stuck with it." She paused, looking at Comyn. "So are you. Stuck with it, I mean. Would you rather be on the outside getting shot at, or on the inside?" "Getting shot at?" "I can't guarantee you anything." "Oh, run away if you want to, Comyn." She had got over her shakes, and he wondered if the champagne might not have been responsible for them. It seemed to be coming over her in a wave now, or else she was talking that way to duck any more questions. "I'm sleepy. I don't care what you do." And she went to sleep, or seemed to, with her head against him and his arm around her. She was no lightweight, but the long, lithe curves of her body were pleasant to follow. He held them, thinking of all the many ways in which this might be a trap. Or was Miss Sidna Cochrane just a little crazy? They said all the Cochranes were a little crazy. They'd been saying that ever since old Jonas had built the ridiculous lunar palace toward which he was now heading. The car was bearing them on toward the spaceport. He could still back out, but he'd have to do it fast. "No, I can't back out," thought Comyn. "Not now." He had only one chance to find out about Paul Rogers, and that was to bluff information out of the Cochranes, if he could. He also only had one chance to maybe get himself on a little solider ground, and that was by the same method. He would never get a better crack at trying. A hard-boiled little lamb going to talk a lot of lions out of their dinner, Comyn told himself grimly. Oh well, if I'm stepping into it, it's in nice company. He settled back, patting Miss Cochrane into a more comfortable position, and wished he knew 2 things: who had paid the boy with the bad teeth to kill him, and whether this ace-in-the-hole he was going to bluff the Cochranes with might not turn out to be just a low spade after all, a spade suitable for grave digging. They went through the spaceport and into the glittering Cochrane yacht as though through a well-oiled machine. When the yacht had cleared, Sidna went sleepily away to change and left Comyn staring with increasing distaste at the blank, enlarging lunar face ahead. Why the devil would anyone want to build a showplace out on this skull's head? They said old Jonas had done it so that the Cochrane wealth and power would be forever in the eyes of all Earth, and that he rarely left it. The old pirate must have a screw loose. The yacht swept in toward the lunar Apennines, showing a magnificent view of the sharp and towering peaks in the full blaze of day. Luna, he thought, could still beat anything in the solar system for sheer scenery if your nerves could stand it. The great ringed plain Archimedes showed its encircling fangs far off to the left, and ahead, on a plateau halfway up that naked mountain wall, he caught a flash of reflected sunlight. "That's the dome," said Sidna. "We're almost there." She didn't sound happy about it. Comyn glanced at her. She had finally come back, wearing white slacks and a silk shirt. She was still fixing her makeup. "If you don't like the place, why do you ever go there?" he asked. She shrugged. "Jonas won't leave it, and we have to show up every so often. He's still head of the family." Comyn looked at her more closely. "You're scared," he said. "Scared of something up here." She laughed. "I don't scare easy." "I believe that," he said. "But you're afraid now." "Of what? Why did you run away from here to New York to get tight?" She looked at him somberly. "Maybe you're about to find out. Or maybe I'm just leading you to the slaughter." He put his hands up on either side of her neck, not tenderly. "Are you?" "Could be, Comyn." "I've got a feeling," he said, "that one of these days I'll be sorry I didn't break this for you right here." "We may both be," she said, and then surprised him when he kissed her, for there was panic in the way she pressed against him. He didn't like it at all, and he liked the whole thing less and less as the yacht swooped smoothly down to that high plateau above the Mare Imbrium. He saw the curve of the enormous pressure dome rising up like a smooth glass mountain flashing in the sun, and then a magnetic tug had hooked onto their ship, and they were being handled smoothly into an airlock. Massive doors closed behind them, and Comyn thought, "Well, here I am, and it's up to the Cochrans whether I ever leave or not." A few minutes later, he was driving with Sidna through rioting gardens that covered several acres toward a pile of masonry he had seen pictured many times before, an old man's arrogant monument to himself, insanely set upon a dead world. The stark structure of native lunar rock had been designed by a master architect to match the lunar landscape. The result was striking, weird, and, he had to admit, beautiful. The lines of the buildings lifted and swept and curved as boldly as the peaks that loomed above them. He followed Sidna out and went up some broad and shallow steps to a portico of tremendous simplicity. Sidna pushed open the great doors that were made of a dully gleaming alloy. The hall inside was high and austere, flooded with filtered lunar sunlight and softened with hangings, rugs, and a few priceless oddments from all over the solar system. The vault of white stone flung back a whispering echo as they moved. Sidna walked halfway along its length, going slower and slower. Then she turned suddenly around as though she wanted to run back. Comyn took her by the shoulder and asked again, "What are you afraid of? I want to know." The echoes of his voice whispered back and forth between the walls. She shrugged, not looking at him, trying to keep her voice light. "Don't you know every castle has a thing living in its cellar? Well, we've got one here, too. Now, and it's a beaut." "What kind of a thing?" demanded Comyn. "I think," said Sidna, "I think it's Ballantyne." Chapter 5. The high vault muttered Ballantyne in 1,000 tiny voices, and Comyn's grip had become a painful thing on Sidna's shoulders. "What do you mean, it's Ballantyne? He's dead. I saw him die." Sidna's eyes met his now, steadily, for a long minute. and it seemed to Comyn that a cold wind blew in that closed place, cold as the spaces between the stars. "They haven't let me go down there," she said, "and they won't talk to me about it, but you can't keep any secrets here. The echoes are too good. And I can tell you another thing. I'm not the only one that's scared." Something caught hold of Comyn's heart and began to shake it. Sidna's face turned indistinct and distant, and he was back again in a little room on Mars, looking at the shadow of a fear that was new under the familiar sun. "Surprise," said Sidna in a cool, light voice with barbs on it. "I've brought a friend of yours." Comyn started and turned. William Stanley was standing in the doorway at the far end of the hall, a smile of welcome turning dark and ugly on his face. Comyn took his hands away from Sidna. Stanley shot him one blazing look and then turned on Sidna. "Of all the hen-brained female tricks, what does it take to make you grow up, Sidna? The end of the world—" "Why, Willie!" She looked at him in innocent amazement. "Did I do wrong?" Stanley's face was now absolutely white. "No," he said, answering his own question and not hers. "Not even the end of the world would do it. You'd still be busy impressing everyone with how devastatingly cute you are. But I don't think that anybody is going to find this one the least bit funny." He jerked his head at Comyn. "Turn around. You're going back to Earth." Sidna was smiling, but her eyes had that lambency that Comyn remembered. She seemed to be much interested in Stanley. "Say that over again, that last bit." Stanley repeated slowly. "I said, this man is going back to Earth." Sidna nodded. "You're getting better at it, Willie. But you're still not good enough." "Good enough at what?" "Giving orders like a Cochrane." She turned her back on him, not insultingly, but as though he just wasn't there. In a voice that had trouble getting out, Stanley said, "We'll see about this." He strode away. Sidna didn't look after him. Neither did Comyn. He had forgotten Stanley after the first minute. I think it's Ballantyne." How long could a thing go on? How ugly could it get? He demanded harshly, "Just what are you trying to give me?" "It's hard to take, isn't it? Maybe you know now why I went down to New York." "Listen," said Comyn, "I was with Ballantyne. His heart had stopped. They tried to get it going again, but it was no use. I saw him. He was dead." "Yes," said Sidna, "I know. That's what makes it so sticky. His heart's still stopped. He's dead, but not quite." Comyn swore at her with a savagery born of fear. "How can a man be dead and—" "How do you know? You said you hadn't been let down to see him. How—" "She listens at keyholes," said a new voice. A man was coming down the hall toward them, his heels clicking angrily on the stone floor. "Listens," he said, "and then talks. Can't you ever learn to keep your mouth shut? Can't you ever stop making trouble?" His face was Sidna's face all over again, but it was without the beauty, high-boned and dark. His eyes had the same brightness, but it was a cruel thing now, and the lines around his mouth were deep. He looked as though he wanted to take Sidna in his two hands and break her. She didn't give any ground. "Throwing a tantrum isn't going to change things, Pete, so you might as well not." Her own eyes had fired up, and her mouth was stubborn. "Comyn, this is Peter Cochrane, my brother. Pete, this is—" The bitter, dark eyes flickered briefly over Comyn. "I know. I've seen him before." He returned his attention to Sidna. Somewhere from the background, Stanley spoke, reiterating his demand that Comyn be sent away. Nobody noticed him. Comyn said, "Where?" On Mars. You wouldn't remember. You weren't feeling well at the time. A vague memory of a voice speaking beyond a thick red haze returned to Comyn. So it was you who broke up the party. The boys were enjoying their work too much. You were liable to be ruined before you talked. He swung around on Comyn. Are you ready to talk now? Comyn stepped closer to him. Is Ballantyne dead? Peter Cochrane hesitated. The wire-drawn look deepened, and a muscle began to twitch under his cheekbone. You and your big mouth, he muttered to Sidna. You. All right, she answered furiously. So you're mad. The hell with you. You and the whole Cochrane tribe aren't getting anywhere on this, and you know it. I thought Comyn might have the answer. Comyn repeated. Is Ballantyne dead? Peter said after a moment. I don't know. Comyn closed his fists hard and took a deep breath. Let's put it another way, then. Dead or alive, I want to see him. No. No, you don't. But you won't know it till afterward. He studied Comyn with a hard, penetrating look. What are you after, Comyn? A chance to cut in? Comyn gestured toward Stanley. I told him already. I told your boys on Mars. I want to find out what happened to Paul Rogers. Just a noble sentiment of friendship? It's too thin, Comyn. More than just friendship, Comyn said. Paul Rogers saved my neck once. He went to bat for me out on Ganymede when he didn't have to. I'll tell you about it sometime. The point is, I like to pay my debts. I'm going to find out about him if I have to blow the Cochranes wide open. You don't, I take it, like the Cochranes, Comyn said savagely. Who does? And you're running true to form now, kicking Ballantyne around like a football, snatching his ship, holding out the logbooks, trying to sew up the big jump, the biggest thing men ever did, like any cheap swindling business deal. Let's get things straight, interrupted Peter harshly. That ship and its star drive belonged to us, and the log broke off just where we said, and we brought Ballantyne here to try to do something for him, about him. He broke off, his face quivering slightly as though in involuntary recoil from some shocking memory. Comyn felt the chill shadow of the other's emotion, but he said again, Are you going to let me see him? Why should I? Why shouldn't I just send you back to Earth? Because, Comyn said grimly, you know I know something, and you want to know what. He doesn't know anything, Stanley exclaimed to Peter. How could he? Ballantyne was in terminal coma and couldn't talk. He's bluffing, trying to chisel in. Maybe, said Peter Cochrane. We'll find out. All right, Comyn. You convince me you know something, and you can see Ballantyne, but I'm making no deals with you beyond that. I'm only one Cochrane, and this concerns all of us. The others won't be here until this evening, Earth time, and we can fight it out then. Fair enough? Comyn nodded. Fair enough. Then what do you know? Not a lot, said Comyn. It was time for his one little card, and he had to play it as casually as though he had a fistful behind it. Not a lot. But I do know there'd be quite a bit of excitement if people thought there was a transuranic world out there. There was a moment of silence. Peter Cochrane didn't change expression, but the color drained slowly out of Stanley's face, leaving it gray. Then Sidna spoke into the silence. He did know, and that's why somebody tried to kill him. Peter Cochrane looked at her sharply. That's ridiculous. He wouldn't be worth a nickel to anybody dead. Do I get to see Ballantyne now? Comyn demanded. Cochrane turned abruptly. Yes, you've asked for it. Sidna, you stay here. You've made enough trouble for one day. I have every intention of staying here, and I need a drink, she said. Comyn followed Peter Cochrane down the corridor. Stanley went with them. There was a sliding metal door at the end of the corridor, and behind it there was a lift that sank downward into the lunar rock, whining softly. Comyn had begun to sweat, and his shirt stuck to him, coldly damp across his back. His heart was pounding, not steadily, but in irregular bursts that made it hard to breathe. The lines in Peter Cochrane's face were deep. He looked as though he hadn't slept for some time. Stanley stood apart from them, withdrawn into his own thoughts. His eyes moved constantly from Comyn to Peter Cochrane and back again. A ridge of muscle showed along his jaw. The lift stopped, and they got out. There was nothing mysterious about these cellars under the Cochrane castle. They held the pumping plants for air and water, the generators, the mountainous quantities of supplies necessary for maintaining life and luxury in this artificial blister on the face of Luna. The rock floor they walked on quivered to the rhythmic throbbing of the pumps. Cochrane moved like a man who was being forced to witness an execution. Comyn thought the man had probably been this way before too often, and he caught the subtle contagion of dread from the dark, strained face. Stanley lagged behind them both, his feet scuffing on the smooth rock. Peter Cochrane paused before a door. He didn't look at anyone. He said, "Why don't you stay out here, Bill?" Stanley said, "No." Comyn's mouth was dry. There was an acrid taste in it, and his nerve ends hurt. Peter Cochrane still hesitated, scowling at his hand as he put it up against the door. Comyn said, "Come on, come on!" His voice came out rough and no louder than a whisper. Cochrane pushed the door open. There was a room cut out of the rock. It had been hastily cleared of most of the stores that had been in it, and just as hastily fitted up with things that made it partly a laboratory, partly a hospital, and partly a cell. Strong lights filled it with a naked and pitiless glare. There were 2 men in it, and something else. Comyn recognized the young doctor from the hospital on Mars. He had lost much of his youth. The other man he didn't know, but the same look of strain and dread was on him. They turned around with the violence that came of overtaxed nerves. They had been startled by the opening of the door. The young doctor looked at Comyn, and his eyes got wide. "You again," he said. "How did you—" "Never mind that," said Cochrane swiftly. He kept his gaze on the doctor, on the floor, anywhere but on the white bed with the side rails up on it. "Is there any change?" Things were fading out for Comyn. He had taken a few steps forward, drawn by that white barred oblong beyond the 2 men, beyond the apparatus and the laboratory benches. The light was very brilliant, very clear. It was focused now upon the bed, and around it things seemed to be fading out. The men, the voices, the emotions. Far off in another world, the doctor was saying, "No change. Roth and I have completed." No. It was bad enough on Mars. I heard him scream and I saw him die, and that was bad enough. Nobody ought to have to look at this. A voice, another one. "I told you before what my findings were. I've verified them as far as anybody can. I can't go beyond the limits of my equipment. This has got to wait for a whole new science." Excitement in the voice, stronger than dread, stronger than anything. "I know that, Roth. I know it." Voices, men, tension, fear. Going round, going faster, dissolving in a darkening mist around that single intense point of light. Comyn put out his hands, not knowing that he did it, and took hold of the cold top bar of the bed. He hung on while the warmth and the strength drained out of him and left him empty of everything but a sickening horror. The thing that lay in the bed between the barred sides was Ballantyne. It was Ballantyne, and it was dead, quite dead. There was no covering on it to hide its deadness, no breathing lifted the flattened ribs, no pulse beat anywhere beneath the pale transparent skin, and the tracery of veins was dark, and the face was dead, and yet it moved. The faint, unceasing twitchings and drawings of the flesh that Comyn remembered when Ballantyne was still alive had increased and taken over now that he was dead. It was as though some new and dreadful form of life had claimed the wasted shell when Ballantyne had left it. A brainless, blind, insensate life that only knew to move, to stir and pluck the string of muscles that lifted the skeletal limbs and put them down again, that made the fingers grasp and close, and the head turn slowly from side to side. It was motion without reason, without sound except for the rustling of the sheet. Motion that laid a blasphemous hand even on the face that had no longer any thought or being behind it, and made it— Comyn heard a hoarse and distant sound. It was himself trying to speak and not making it. He let go of the bed. After that, he didn't hear or see anything until he fetched up against some solid object with a crash that knocked some sense back into him. He stood where he was, shaking all over, the breath coming raw and rasping into his throat. Gradually, the room stopped swinging, and he was able to think again. Peter Cochrane said, "You wanted to come?" Comyn didn't answer. He moved away from the bed as fast as he could get and kept his back to it. He could still hear the dry, vague rustling that never stopped. Cochrane returned to the doctor. "What I want to know for sure," he said, "is this. Could Ballantyne ever live again? As Ballantyne, I mean, as a human being?" The doctor made a decisive gesture. "No. Ballantyne died from heart failure due to exhaustion. He is dead by every normal physiologic standard. His brain is already deteriorating, but his body has in it a residue of some weird new physiological activity. I can hardly call it life." "What kind of activity? We're not scientists, Doctor." The other hesitated. "The ordinary processes of metabolism ceased in Ballantyne's body cells when he died, but there's a residual process that keeps going on, and it's something brand new. It's a low-level flow of energy in the cells, not generated by the usual biochemical metabolic process, but by the slow degeneration of certain transuranic elements." Comyn looked up sharply. "You mean," Cochrane was saying slowly, "he has suffered a kind of radioactive poisoning?" The doctor shook his head, and Roth said firmly, "No, this is definitely not toxic radioactivity. The elements that Ballantyne's body cells absorbed are beyond the range of our chemistry, even of the transuranic chemistry our labs have been dabbling with. They don't emit injurious radiation, but do release energy." They glanced briefly and against their will at the bed, and Cochrane said somberly, "Then his movements are merely a mechanical reflex?" The doctor nodded. "Yes. The cytoplasm of the contractile tissue cells, such as the muscle fibers, is constantly activated by the flow of energy." "But he's really dead?" "Yes, he's dead." Stanley broke into the brooding moment of silence that followed. "What are we going to do with him? We can't let people see him. There'd be an uproar, an examination, and it would all be out." "No, we can't let people see him," Cochrane agreed slowly. He said after a moment to Stanley, "You get the Earth News Services on the phone. Tell them that we're going to give Ballantyne the hero's funeral he deserves, and one that all Earth can see." "All Earth? Peter, you're crazy." "Am I? Maybe. Anyway, Ballantyne had no close family, so nobody can stop us. Tell them to watch the northwest corner of Mare Imbrium in an hour." Comyn got it then. He exhaled a long breath. Cochrane glanced at him briefly, and then once more at the barred, unquiet bed. "I know how you feel," he said, Besides, he's come a long way. He deserves to rest. They went out then, back up into the light, into the cooled and freshened air and the scent of flowers that came in from the rioting gardens. And in Comyn's mind, that faint, remembered voice was whispering, "Oh, God, why did it have to be transuranic?" And he was sick, with a sickness that he thought would never leave him while he lived. Sidna was waiting. Cochrane and Stanley were busy now with this thing they were about to do. They hardly noticed when she took Comyn by the arm and led him off, out to a terrace above the gardens where the filtered sunlight poured down fiercely and took some of the coldness out of his bones. She put a drink in his hands and waited, looking at his face until he noticed her and began to speak. "Don't tell me about it," she said sharply. "No." After a moment she drew closer to him and murmured, "Don't look so startled or surprised. They can see us from the windows. Comyn, will you leave here now? I can still get you away." He looked down at her. "What's the matter?" "You were down there a long time. The family has started to arrive." "Comyn, you've had a few." "And I wish I'd had more. Listen, I got you into this. I blew my top about Ballantyne and brought you up here. I'm trying to get you out while I can still do it." His eyes were bleak. "Afraid I am trying to cut in on the profits?" "You bloody fool! Don't you know us Cochranes? This thing is big, and that means people are going to get hurt. Will you go?" Comyn shook his head. "I can't." She looked at him narrow-eyed, and then she said mercilessly, "Are you sure now you want to find your friend Paul Rogers?" Comyn was glad he didn't have to answer that question right now, for at the moment, from the terrace, they saw the sleek, purring, airtight truck heading away from the mansion and going toward the lock. They watched it in silence as it went out of the dome and down the ledges, back and forth, onto the great lunar plain. It went so far out on the plain that it was but a dot. It stayed there a while and then came back. Then, for them and for all watching Earth to see, upon the Mare Imbrium flared a dazzling flower of atomic flame, blazing, soaring, and then dying away. A hero's funeral pyre with a world for witness. Comyn unclenched his hands, and Sidna slipped something into one of them. It was a shocker, still warm from her body. She said, "All right. Come on and meet my family."